This meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 111 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Finance. Now pursuant to Standing Order 83, Bracket 1, and the motion adopted by the committee on Thursday, June 8, 2023. The committee is meeting to discuss the pre-budget consultations in advance of the 2024 budget. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Members are attending in person, in the room, and remotely using the Zoom application. I'd like to make a few comments for the benefit of the witnesses and the members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. Although this room is equipped with powerful audio system, feedback events can occur. These can be extremely harmful to our interpreters and cause serious injuries. The most common cause of sound feedback is an earpiece worn too close to a microphone. We therefore ask all participants to exercise a high degree of caution when handling the earpieces, especially when your microphone or your neighbor's microphone is turned on. In order to prevent incidents and safeguard the hearing health of our interpreters, I invite participants to ensure they speak into the microphone into which their headset is plugged in, and to avoid manipulating the earbuds by placing them on the table away from the microphone when they are not in use. Reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raised hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can. We appreciate your patience and understanding in this regard. Members, before we move on to our witnesses, just for some more clarity, based on discussions that are ongoing, I can confirm with members that we're currently scheduled for 2.5 hours on Monday with the Governor of the Bank of Canada. And we already are checking now to possibly extend. We believe we have that for 3 hours, and that will also be dependent on the governor, of course, but also on committee resources, and we are still checking on that. So just for members, for our meeting on October 30th. So now I'd like to welcome our witnesses. With us today, we have as an individual Marc Purdon. He's the professor chair in decarbonization at the University of Quebec in Montreal. Welcome. From the Assembly of First Nations, we have interim national chief Joanna Bernard is with us. And also with Chief Bernard, we have Senior Director, Economic Development and Infrastructure Branch, Julie Pellerin. From the Business Council of Canada, Senior Vice President of Policy, Robert Aslan is with us. And from the Cannabis Council of Canada, its President and Chief Executive Officer, George Smitherman, is joining us. And from FinTechs Canada, we've got the Executive Director, Alex Veronsis. And from Oxfam Quebec, the Director of Policy and Campaigns, Deanna Sarosi, joined also by Policy Analyst Leah Pelletier-Marcotte. So on that, we are going to get right into the witnesses' opening statements, and we'll start with, as an individual, Mr. Marc Purdon, please, for 5 minutes.
Bonjour, hello. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak. I guess I'll just introduce myself briefly. I'm a professor at UQAM in Montreal. I have a training. I'm a political scientist by training, but I'm at the business school where there's an interdisciplinary department focusing on environmental and social responsibility. But I'm also holding the chair in decarbonization, and I do a lot of work on climate policy, Quebec and Canadian climate policy. A lot of work on the Quebec carbon market, which is linked with California, as well as its relationship with transportation decarbonization. There's a lot of other regulatory instruments in the transportation sector, which is the second largest source of emissions in Canada. I also do a lot of research on international climate finance, which could also be of interest to the committee. A bit more detailed, I could just speak to the some opportunities to address decarbonization in the Canadian transportation sector. One issue is to continue with the clean technology credits. I think this year's federal budget was an excellent response start to the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, which has really been a global game changer in terms of clean energy production and incentives. But we need to perhaps be willing to do more on the production of clean fuels and clean vehicles. Some research that I've done suggests that when those incentives are available to individuals, it actually has positive political effects, that people are ready to pay, absorb a higher carbon price, so to effectively, because they have those clean technology options as an off-ramp. But other research in the transportation sector might consider efforts to address transportation demand management. So that's how major metropolitan regions, other regions of Canada manage emissions from transportation. So getting people from using their private vehicles into public transportation. And there is a lot I think we could do there with planning, transportation system planning in major metropolitan regions. There's some research we've done looking at California. California has a very, very rigorous transportation planning process using very sophisticated models to estimate the impacts on greenhouse gas emissions of their transportation planning in major metropolitan regions like LA, San Francisco, et cetera. And that is tied to federal and state funding for transportation infrastructure. So that's something that I think you can maybe revise or improve the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Program to have some more sophisticated requirements, maybe using some of these modeling tools, as we see in California. The other issue I thought I would briefly address is emissions trading. Quebec has the emissions trading system with California, which is quite different from the federal carbon pricing system. And arguably, it is, in my view, allowed Quebec to be more ambitious with its climate efforts than it would have otherwise been. Quebec reduced its emissions by 11% below 1990 levels without that emissions trading system. But including the emission reduction allowances purchased by Quebec firms in California, it doubled that emission reduction, reduced Quebec's emissions by minus 26%. So you can compare that with other jurisdictions in Canada, just as a way of comparison, if you want, maybe unfair. British Columbia has a carbon tax comparable to the $65 on the of the federal carbon backstop right now. British Columbia's emissions have increased by about 10 or 11% since 1990, a 1% reduction since 2007. So there's some advantages. The reason that has worked in this case for Quebec is because it's cheaper to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in California, because it's a dirtier economy than Quebec is, so to speak. There's some questions about that, whether the market is working. I'm happy to discuss that in more detail. But the prices on the Quebec carbon market linkage with California have been rising. They're about $47 a ton right now versus $65 on the Canadian federal carbon tax. So there's maybe something to revisit there. But also emphasize Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement was agreed in 2021 in Glasgow, and that is sort of recognized legitimate usage of these emission trading systems at the UN level. So I'll conclude with that. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Perdon. And now to hear from the Assembly of First Nations, we have Interim National Chief Joanna Bernard, please.
Kwei, thank you for the invite. I do want to acknowledge that we are on the lands, unceded and unsurrendered territories of the Algonquin people here in Ottawa. And again, thank you for inviting me. First Nations contribute to the Canadian economy when provided an even playing field. Research consistently demonstrates that closing social, economic, and infrastructure gaps benefits the Canadian economy. Sorry, I'm a little nervous. From a purely economic standpoint, investing in Canada's...
Yeah, make which, yes.
Pardon?
Make which.
Thank you. Which. So from a purely economic standpoint, investing in Canada's youngest and fastest growing demographics just makes sense. Each year, We see new research data estimating the benefits to be realized by the Canadian economy and by all Canadians if we close the social economic outcome gaps for First Nations. In recent years, the National Aboriginal Economic Development Board estimated to benefit to the GDP about $27 billion per year, which is about 1.5% of the GDP. While progress has been made on First Nation priorities, significant gaps remain. Without sustainable and adequate investments, these gaps will continue to grow. The committee took delivery of the AFN's 2024 pre-submission budget submission that provides a roadmap for Canada to make meaningful investments that are aligned with the obligations to uphold First Nations' unique and inherent rights. While the economy initiatives are compelled, let's be clear on the term of the day: economic reconciliation. Each of these investments allows detailed long-term investments toward First Nation priorities to eliminate social economic gaps. It also meets the objectives set out by the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples. First Nations have always demonstrated good governance and are skilled negotiators. I remind all of you that First Nations agreed to share lands only to the depth of the plow. Canada must abandon its long-standing disputes and pay its debts. In a single year, Canada's natural resource exports exceed $330 billion in 2022. Each year, Canada does not share the proceeds of these resources and fails to pay its debts to First Nations. Results are in increasing social, economic, and infrastructure gaps. Canada must acknowledge its obligations to provide the adequate, predictable, and sustainable funding to close these gaps and to ensure they remain closed. This includes resources for capacity building, supports for First Nations-led sustainable development, and institutions. Economic reconciliation occurs once you are no longer managing poverty, but managing wealth. It also understands that health, healing, resiliency, and self-determination are the foundation of prosperity and wealth building. Economic reconciliation requires substantial efforts to overcome the impacts to First Nations who have been dispossession of their lands, economics, customs, and cultures. Canada must take next steps and effective measures to meet the obligations of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. An essential element of Canada's fiduciary responsibility is to ensure that First Nations enjoy the same standards of living as non-Indigenous Canadians and to achieve equality and equity in all. Economic reconciliation goes beyond equitable access to capital, participation in government procurement, and resource revenue sharing. Ultimately, it requires government-to-government new fiscal relations between Canada and First Nations. By the way, the AFN represents over 1.5 First Nation citizens. So it's a very large organization. And we do deliver results for their people according to the unique priorities and needs for Canada and to achieve economic reconciliation. A new distinct approach for budget setting must align with inherent rights, international treaties signed by the Crown, and respect the nation-to-nation relationships. The current process for funding First Nation priorities is outdated and ineffective. First Nations, every year, the AFN condenses a budget priorities for over 630 First Nations rights holders in a 200,000-word brief. The AFN and First Nations are then subject to scrutiny in the external bureaucracy to the Department of Finance. hoping to secure incremental funding that remains far below the level of need. Canada has fiduciary obligations and the First Nations have rights, which do not change from one year to the other. Neither should the funding commitments required to uphold them. The AFN pre-budget brief consists of critical elements to meet First Nations diversity and significant needs, including investments detailed in the comprehensive analysis that supports the Minister of Indigenous Services, mandated to close the infrastructure gap by 2030. Roads, utilities, digital connectivity, facilities, and housing are fundamental for economic opportunity and growth. The AFN and Indigenous Service Canada worked with industry-led experts to develop a comprehensive costing and the report on closing the infrastructure gap by 2030, which covers several of these items, such as the $135 billion identified to meet critical and outstanding housing needs. That's just in housing. Our submission also details investments required to meet First Nation needs in education, programming, and to immediately build, replace, repair, and expand First Nation schools and eliminate overcrowding. It includes investments to properly fund infrastructure, retrofitting, and other means to ensure First Nations can meet the requirements for accommodating modern accessibility standards and address inequalities faced by persons with disabilities. It includes investments to bridge the digital divide for First Nations by meeting the minimum broadband standards outlined in Canada's federal connectivity strategy, high-speed access for all. It details investments towards First Nations leadership in climate, conservation, and food security, which are the most effective means to combat climate and biodiversity loss crisis. I think I'm running out of time, so I'm going right down to the back.
So we do want to thank you, Interim National Chief Bernard, and thank you for your opening statement. Thank you for being here with us before our committee.
Did I use my 5 minutes? Oh, I was going with my closing. I was skipping all that.
Yeah, so you'll have a lot of opportunity during members' questions to expand on many of the points that you've made, but we thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now we're going to hear from the Business Council of Canada, and Mr. Robert Aslan, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The state of the world today reminds us of the inherent fragility of our international order and the global economy. For a country such as Canada, geopolitical shocks such as these have a deep impact. The global environment is only further compounding the challenges we were already experiencing domestically. Here at home, Canadians are feeling the weight of high interest rates, low productivity, and persistent inflation. Canada's GDP per capita has been trending down for several quarters, and without our natural resources, Canada's trade deficit would be structural and significant. Our population is also aging fast. Going forward, private sector economists' forecasts point to no growth in 2024 and subdued growth thereafter. Whether there's a technical recession will be of little comfort to Canadians, as interest rates are expected to remain high for the foreseeable future. For the federal government, debt servicing costs will continue to be much more prohibitive than previously forecasted in Budget 2023. Growth rates that are lower than interest rates will have a dramatic impact on fiscal policy. Governments can no longer run permanent large deficits without fear. This fiscal year, the federal government will use almost as much of its revenues to service the debt than providing healthcare transfers to provinces and territories. This is why we continue to urge the government to adopt a new and credible fiscal anchor, one which would limit debt servicing costs to a maximum of 10% of revenue going forward. By doing this, we think it will preserve the government capacity to fund programs Canadians rely on and not put an excessive and unfair fiscal burden on future generations. The more the federal government spends on servicing the debt, the less it has to fund anything else. Des dépenses accrues financées via l'emprunt public et des taux d'intérêt.
So when we have higher interest rates, inevitably, this will mean that the debt levels will force future governments to cut spending and or raise taxes. It will lead to a weakened economy with considerable uncertainty for businesses looking to invest, hire and grow in Canada. It would also put in jeopardy the social programs and services that Canadians expect from their government. This is precisely what we must avoid. We are not of the view that new spending is required in the next budget. The federal government has introduced many measures, in particular when it comes to energy transition, that have not yet been implemented. We also urge the government to move ahead with a real comprehensive programme review, as well as implementing the measures announced in Budget 2023, such as the commitment to outline a concrete plan on permitting reform by the end of this year. And in the aftermath of last week's Supreme Court ruling on the Impact Assessment Act, it is essential that the government move ahead quickly to provide clarity, certainty and predictability on the rules that will apply to projects. We must not lose out on once-in-a-generation business investments that are necessary to reduce our emissions and foster economic growth for the benefit of all Canadians. Thank you, Chair.
Monsieur Aslan,
Thank you very much, Mr. Aslan.
the Cannabis Council of Canada, and Mr. George Smitherman.
Thank you. Good day, Chair, Vice Chairs, members of the committee. In the spirit of reconciliation, I wish to acknowledge the great privilege that I have of being on these Algonquin lands and wherever I am in Canada, celebrating my good fortune. Members of the committee, it's such a great privilege to be here today because all politics is local. I want to say that I started my day in Simcoe North, where the leaves are hanging on, and I know in some parts of the country winter is fully in the grips. I'm very privileged to be here today with the chair of the board of the Cannabis Council, Rick Savone, who previously served Canada with distinction as our ambassador to Brazil. Our association is the leading voice for regulated producers and processors of cannabis in Canada, and we very much appreciate the opportunity to draw urgent attention to the state of the regulated cannabis sector as October 17th marked the 5th anniversary of adult use legalization. That historic action undertaken by Parliament enjoys continued strong support amongst Canadians, and various reports issued after 5 years support the idea that the worst predicted outcomes of legalization have not occurred, while social and health impact studies have indicated areas where ongoing research about the potential of cannabis is warranted. More challenging are the economic conditions facing the regulated cannabis sector. In a recent study involving more than 120 licensed producers and processors of cannabis in Canada, results indicated that profitability has been elusive, achieved by only 17% of cannabis companies surveyed. These results are presented against a backdrop of massive investment and then dramatic subsequent disinvestment. In a study completed by Deloitte on behalf of the Ontario Cannabis Store, data showed that during the first 3 years of adult use or recreational legalization alone, the industry invested $45 billion building out 3,500 stores and operations amongst up to 900 production licenses issued by Health Canada. The GDP impact of that build-out supported up to 150,000 jobs and impacts on par with powerhouse sectors like automotive manufacturing and dairy, albeit more broadly distributed, especially in rural Canadian communities. I might add that the cannabis sector was powering forward with investment and expansion under COVID conditions, while many other sectors were sidelined. The conditions that contribute to challenges that we are facing certainly include those having to do with building an industry literally without a roadmap from anywhere on the globe. Difficult decisions to address surplus capacity are taking place, as in any business. And as the list of CCAA filings shows, the cannabis sector has been leading all sectors, sadly I say, with 40% of filers since 2022 coming from the cannabis sector. Members of the committee know very well that such numbers have a personal implication for families and communities. Instead of having a world-leading first-mover advantage, we're dealing with challenges in our own country that are dragging us down. Bluntly put, our sector is having its full potential to compete with the illicit market due to suffocating government middle of taxes and fees, frequently representing well over 60% of the final price of any product paid by a consumer. This formula inadequately distributes the consumer dollar in a way that creates prospects for the unregulated and illegal players, and it also puts up barriers for those patients that find relief in medical cannabis that they can't find elsewhere. Meantime, a considerable lack of interest in enforcement means that the illicit market flourishes without headwinds. Hard as this may be to hear after 5 years, that illicit cannabis world enjoys numerous commercial advantages even beyond the lack of taxes, fees, and regulation. They're everywhere online. They use Interact. They use Canada Post. In contrast, many cannabis producers and retailers cannot access basic financial services, and when they do, they are usually subjected to usurious service rates. It has frequently been described to me that it feels as if you put up your hand and say you are willing to be regulated, then government, frequently from different levels, has every tax, fee, and rule for you. But if you set up an illegal shop on the other side of the line, almost nobody will take notice or care. Last week, our sector was in Ottawa, where we celebrated 5 years of adult use legalization, and we drilled down on areas where we're asking for change. We need adjustments to the excise tax formula and to costly matters about how the formula operates. We need the elimination of a special tax of 2.3% in the name of a regulatory fee charged by Health Canada that neither alcohol nor tobacco pay. This is about $75 million off the bottom line of companies. And we need regulated formats that align with the cannabis consumer, especially in edibles, where the regulatory prohibition pushes people to consume untested products from the illicit market at risk to them and their children because they look like candy, chips, and cookies. We've presented these proposals for incremental change that can create the conditions for companies to be successful and fulfill the promise of legalization, including attracting more cannabis consumers to the protections afforded by a regulated environment. Thank you, and I look forward to any questions that might arise.
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Smitherman, and I'm sure there will be many questions. We're going now to FinTechs Canada, and Mr. Alex Varonsis, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and members of the committee for inviting us to participate in this pre-budget consultation. My name is Alex Varonsis, and I'm the Executive Director of FinTechs Canada, an industry association of Canada's most innovative financial technology companies. Collectively, our members serve millions of Canadians on a daily basis, which means our members help your constituents manage their finances and pay for things every day. This is why the premise of our pre-budget submission isn't an easy thing for me to say aloud. We represent a growing chunk of the financial sector, and yet here I am to tell you that the financial sector is letting Canadian consumers and businesses down. Over the course of their lives, consumers pay thousands of dollars in banking fees. For many of them, you can imagine that what they're paying exceeds what their savings are able to generate in interest. The Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses surveys its members and puts out report cards on Canada's banks. They consistently get low scores for their customer service, their access to capital, and their fees. According to research from Payments Canada and Ernst & Young, Canadian businesses pay $14 to $32 billion every 5 years just to receive and send money. The fees and customer dissatisfaction in Canada aren't unique. What's unique in Canada is that we've yet to do anything about them. Other advanced economies, including much of Europe, the United Kingdom, Australia, and the United States, they've had the same issues, but they've been making their financial sectors work harder for their citizens. They've been doing it by modernizing their financial sector laws and infrastructure. In other countries, citizens have been put in control of their financial information, which protects their financial security while giving them a way to access the tools they need to meet their financial goals. But not yet in Canada. Millions of Canadians choose to share their financial information in exchange for better services. A great example of this program, or of this, is a program that lets Canadians use proof of rent payments to build their credit score, so that one day they can qualify for a mortgage. But the way Canadians are forced by their banks to share that financial information today is unreliable and risky. Businesses in other countries have been given lower cost and faster ways to send and receive money, but not yet in Canada. Small businesses aren't being paid on time, our members are finding, according to their own research, which is forcing businesses to take out loans and make ends meet. whether that's to make payroll or fulfill a new order. According to the World Bank, Canada is one of the few countries in the world to not have a real-time payment system. When the United Kingdom built theirs, one of our members was able to slash costs for their customers by 20% immediately after gaining access to it. This is why we encourage the government to double down on its recent commitments to make the financial sector more affordable for Canadians. We ask this committee to recommend that the government, 1, give Canadians a way to shop around for the best services. Do this by implementing an open banking framework that puts Canadians in control of their financial information. 2, protect Canadian sensitive financial information. Do this by establishing an independent oversight body that's going to be the referee of the framework, making sure that everyone is following the rules. 3, uphold the integrity of our financial sector. Do this by supporting Payments Canada's efforts to build a real-time payment system. And 4, give Canadians lower cost, safer, and faster ways to send and receive money. Do this by amending the Canadian Payments Act to include credit unions and payment service providers in Canada's supervised payment system. Other countries have done this and more. While other countries are making their financial sectors work harder for their citizens and small businesses, Canadians continue to wait for a financial sector that works harder for them. On behalf of FinTechs Canada and all of our members, thank you again for the opportunity to participate in this consultation. We and our members are keen to keep working with you all to make the financial sector more affordable for Canadians.
Well, thank you, Mr. Vrancis. And now to Oxfam Quebec. And I understand the time is being shared by Ms. Pelletier-Marcotte and Ms. Sarosi. 5 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and dear members of the committee. I'm accompanied by my colleague Diana Sarosi from Oxfam Canada, and thank you for having invited Oxfam Quebec and Canada to participate today and present to you some of our recommendations. As we're speaking here today, the world finds itself at the intersection of a multitude of crises. Climate crisis, inequality crisis, humanitarian crises, all exacerbated by the upheaval of the COVID-19 pandemic, armed conflict and inflation. This context is conducive to the weakening of the foundations of democracy, as well as the erosion of rights, especially those of women and girls in the world. This is why the next budget can and must be an opportunity to ensure our common prosperity by fighting against all forms of inequality and climate change and for gender rights and gender justice. When it comes to development aid, and given the current context, the government must increase the international aid envelope by at least $1.2 billion in new and additional funds over 2021-2022 levels. Only such an investment this will help us to reduce global inequalities and promote a more stable, prosperous and greener global economy. In this respect, Canada must do its fair share and increase funding to combat climate change in low-income countries, including by granting a higher number of subsidies for adaptation to climate change, as well as compensating for loss and damage, and give priority to projects, in particular for women and girls, and make sure that they're involved in these decisions. The climate crisis is threatening the future and present of people everywhere. To build a sustainable future and meet its climate commitments, Canada must not only stop financing projects that cause pollution, but also put in place the necessary regulatory framework that is truly sustainable finance. For sustainable finance. A recent Oxfam Quebec report on the carbon footprint of Canada's banks allowed us to conclude that if Canada's 8 largest allies were to form a sovereign country, they would be the 5th largest emitters of greenhouse gases in terms of emissions financed by their asset banks. So they would just follow behind China, the US, India and Russia in terms of being the largest emitters. That's why we're recommending particular legislative measures be adopted to ensure that Canadian banks adopt plans, targets and practices that are compatible with Canada's climate commitments and the objectives of the Paris Agreement, including the measurement and reduction of financed emissions.
The soaring cost of living is now a predominant conversation topic among Canadians. Low-income Canadians in particular struggle with a cost of living crisis and a housing crisis. Yet Canada's biggest corporations are reaping record-level profits and not paying their fair share of taxes. In 2021, corporations enjoyed their lowest ever recorded income tax rate, despite having their third highest recorded profit rate, thanks in part to over $100 billion in federal pandemic support. Canadian corporations pay so little tax that less than 1 week of revenues covered all their income taxes for the entire year in 2022. Meanwhile, public services that benefit all Canadians, such as healthcare, disability care, long-term care, education, and public transport, remain dramatically underfunded. Also, a lot of the public services, especially in the care sector, are disproportionately done by women. In Canada, care workers make up nearly 1/5 of the total employed labor force. Yet the care sector is characterized by low wages, low status, and poor working conditions, especially for racialized women, and the sector is left with a recruitment and retention crisis due to high levels of burnout. Budget 2024 should respond to our current economic crisis by investing in the people who keep our society strong and resilient. Expanding the care economy and the public and emergency services on which Canadians depend should be a core priority. Establishing a National Care Economy Commission can identify current gaps, recommend solutions and best practices, and direct federal investments in a strategic manner. To pay for the essential services on which we all depend, the federal government should raise new public revenues by implementing a wealth tax on the super rich and windfall taxes on large corporations who are reaping super profits. The government should coordinate its investments in the care economy with its sustainable jobs agenda. A just energy transition presents a unique opportunity and avenue to promote gender equality and inclusiveness in the world of work. The Sustainable Jobs Act, Bill C-50, mentions the creation of employment opportunities for groups underrepresented in the labor market, including women, persons with disabilities, Indigenous peoples, Black and other racialized people, 2S LGBTQIA+, and other equity-seeking groups. This will require significant investments and a workforce strategy that explicitly recognizes care infrastructure as part of Canada's climate resilience. Canada's care strategy and climate action must come together in the Sustainable Jobs agenda. To conclude, Canada's next budget should make clear that a more green, stable, and fair world would benefit all Canadians. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you to Oxfam Quebec and to all our witnesses for your opening statements. We're going to get right into members' questions. In the first round of questions, each party is going to have up to 6 minutes to ask you questions. We're starting with MP Morantz, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for your presentations. They've been very interesting. Mr. Asselin, I want to start with you. And I found your comments very insightful in your opening statement. For the last couple of years, my colleagues and I have been arguing that the central bank's program of money printing, essentially what they call quantitative easing, and the expansion in government spending is inflationary in nature. And that argument we made in this committee several times. There's been very little buy-in, although we did have, for example, Tiff Macklem confirm about a year ago when I was questioning him that he thought that if government spending had been less, that inflation would have been less. But we've never had Governor Macklem come out and say how inflationary the fiscal policy of the government could be until yesterday, where during the Monetary Policy Report press conference he said, and I'm quoting, "We expect government spending to grow at 2.5%. What that means is that if all those spending plans are realized, government spending will be adding to demand more than to supply, and in an environment where we are trying to moderate spending and get inflation down, that's not helpful." Very strong words from the bank governor. And basically what he's saying is that this spending is causing inflation and is making his job harder. Would you agree with that sentiment?
I would agree that, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I would agree that for the last few years, fiscal policy has not been aligned with monetary policy and that one has been working against each other. It is harder for the bank to do its job to bring back inflation at 2%. The government keeps spending over 2%, which is the price stability target for the bank over time, and that's just simple math. And by the way, this includes provincial governments as well, because they do spend quite a bit of money. So I think it's really important that at the end of the day, fiscal policy is aligned with monetary policy. And why is that? Because we do want the cost of living to come down for Canadians, and we do want Canadians to have the purchasing power that enable them to live through things that they can afford. If we don't do that, we're just making lives of Canadians harder. I think it's just simple math. And so without going into the specific, I would say that I very much agree with Governor Macklem comments yesterday.
And you have written on this subject recently, and this is in the context of a government that likes to say it wants to help the middle class and those working hard to join it. You wrote, "One fact is a government doubling down on an expansionary fiscal policy in a time of monetary tightening and high interest rates will work against the best interests of the middle class." Do you think, given your point, which I completely agree with, that fiscal policy and monetary policy have not been working together, do you have any confidence that this government's going to get spending under control and try and bring them into line?
I take the finance minister to her words. She's been saying that she understands this, and I'm hoping that the government will understand the importance of bringing back spending to a reasonable level. Again, what's the finality here? The finality is to work for the benefit of Canadians, and the benefit of Canadians on fiscal policy is that we bring back inflation back to 2% as fast as we can. Because the more time it takes, the more painful it is on the cost of living. It's as simple as that. And so it's not a question of having a small government or a big government. The question right now is just cyclical. We need to bring back spending to a level that won't make Canadians' life harder.
Thank you for that. But on the question of the Minister of Finance, she did say, for example, in Budget 2022 that the debt ratio was a line she wouldn't cross. Now she's saying she recognizes the problem. So I do have some concerns about whether or not she might actually follow through with the advice she's now getting from not only people like you, but the Governor of the Bank of Canada as well. In fact, I noted that in the paper that you wrote with Governor Dodge, you said you have very little confidence that the interest cost ratio and the debt ratio will be able to be maintained over the rest of the decade. So, for example, even though the finance minister has also promised that that was a line she would not cross and that it would continue to decline, what is the concern if the debt to GDP ratio continues to rise over the rest of the decade?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Mr. Chair. The basic math is that the more you spend on debt servicing, the less you have to spend on anything else, as I said in my remarks. And that includes healthcare, education, all the things I think Canadians cherish and want more of, including international aid, including more defense on spending. And so the more, as we did in the 90s, the more we spent on interest rates rising and servicing our debt, the less we spend on these core missions of the state, the core priority. So the fiscal anchor, I think it's important to say, Mr. Chair, is not an end in itself. What the fiscal anchor is trying to protect is the ability for the government to preserve its capacity to give services and programs to Canadians without hiking taxes, without cutting programs that have been so difficult to go through in the 90s when we had to do it. And so the whole idea is to preserve that capacity so we don't have to go back to a situation where any governments, have to do difficult things and then, unfortunately, hurt Canadians with program cuts or hike takes.
Thank you, and thank you, MP Morantz. And now to MP Thompson, please.
Thank you, and thank you, Chair, and welcome to all of the witnesses. If I could begin with Professor Purdon, please. In a recent article, you argued that carbon price has minimal impact on the cost of living. Could you elaborate on that, please?
No, I think that's not what I was saying. I think what the question that was posed to me by the journalist was whether carbon pricing was causing inflation, the primary cause of inflation. and inflation is reality. We're all feeling it. But the carbon pricing in Quebec is not the primary cause of that inflation. It's more the macroeconomic and political situation in Canada and the world right now, with conflicts and rising energy prices, shutting off oil, the results of COVID, supply chain disruptions. So in that context, my comments were to the effect that it's the rising cost of living is not necessarily, we can't blame that on carbon pricing.
Thank you. So we sort of in the same thread. If we cut the price on pollution, there are those who say that if we cut the price on pollution to reduce the price on fuel and everything that depends on that in the production chain, if we went with this idea, would the impact on the cost of living remain minimal, or would that have a tremendous impact on the cost of living?
Well, I mean, I think if you want to project how carbon pricing and associated, so carbon pricing, we could talk about the price of the emissions allowances on the carbon market or the backstop carbon price, but there's also the clean fuel regulations which have been introduced, which also are, you could say that's a carbon price, although it's a differently structured instrument. We are going to see rising costs. $170 is what the carbon tax is supposed to rise to. That would add about 32 cents to a liter of gasoline, given its current carbon content. And I think the clean fuel regulations would rise to, I think it would add 17 cents by 2030. So yeah, it's going to be politically sensitive. There's a lot of public opinion research out there that suggests as carbon pricing increases, and if you transform that into sort of a number that people understand, like the price of gas, people are not so excited about it. I think one thing I can mention here, and I reference it a bit more in detail in my submitted comments. I did a public opinion survey last year in Quebec, and we asked people what different scenarios, different carbon prices scenarios, higher, increasing. And one thing that came out in the results, which was very interesting, we also asked questions if you have an electric vehicle. And when people own an electric vehicle, that trend where declining support with increasing carbon pricing, it falls off. People are ready to support a higher carbon price because they have an electric vehicle, but only the downside is only 8% of our respondents of our sample had electric vehicles. So it was a sort of a very minor effect, but the implication is if more people have access to these clean technologies, they're going to support more ambitious climate policy in Quebec or in Canada. The final note I would say is that the carbon price in Quebec is linked with California, and it's much lower, $47 versus $65. I know these numbers are a little wonky, but it's quite effective in the sense that a lot of emission reductions are being achieved in California. And I know there's a critique that it's an outflow of capital from Quebec to California. But this is, the situation with a lot of our economy. We buy things from U.S. and other countries because that's cheaper or for some reasons. So there's a logic behind that. California is a bit of an outlier in the United States, but Washington has come online. Nova Scotia is part of this Western Climate Initiative. It's generally cheaper, from my read of literature, to reduce emissions in the United States relative to Canada. So there's going to be a bit of that price advantage if we do emissions trading system linked with the United States. But it's maybe something to explore because it does allow costs to be brought down. And I think there are concerns whether we are going to be able to hit that $170 target for the federal carbon tax. I know some of the conservatives may, in the room, it's a very salient political issue right now. So there are some structures, and I'll just say that just recently, in this past few years, emissions trading systems have been emerging in many other countries. China has one, which has maybe some concerns there, but India and Brazil are also establishing ones. And then there are some emissions climate finance mechanisms that are being developed under the UN, under the Paris Agreement and Glasgow Climate Pact. And that will also have some opportunities for reducing emissions in cooperation with other developing economies where costs reducing emissions are lower. So it's something that I think Canada might want to revisit and consider that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, MP Thompson. And now to the block, and MP Chabot, please.
Merci, Monsieur. Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here and taking time to inform us about the best possible solutions that could be included in the budget. And thank you in particular to Oxfam Quebec. Thank you for being here, Oxfam. And my first questions are going to be put to you. Right away, you explained the context in which we find ourselves, this context of a crisis with housing, a humanitarian crisis, and these big wars that are very worrisome. And I think that one of the recommendations that you've underlined is to attack inequalities, in particular gender-based inequalities, such as the situation of women and girls. And so the Government of Canada needs to give its fair share in terms of development aid, and you're recommending there should be $1.2 billion that should be added. So I've got a question on that. How can we convince the federal government to invest these sums? It is an investment, not an expenditure. And what could it actually change? Thank you very much for that question. I'm going to start.
Je pense qu'une façon de
I think that one way of convincing the government is, first of all, by using its rhetoric. It wants to be a feminist government that has a feminist international aid policy, and it's saying it wants to defend rights and equality throughout the world as well as back home. And in order to keep this promise and really change the situation so that we can really see equality for women and girls in the world, I believe that we have to use the government's own rhetoric to convince them to increase the foreign aid. And why do we refer to 2021-2022 levels? It's because last year, before the adoption of the 2023 budget, we'd already made this request to have new and additional funding to actually meet these expectations, but this was not done. In fact, that there were cuts that we observed, so that is why we're repeating this request this year, if we really want this promise to be kept.
Yes, of course, there's a moral incentive, but there's also a very pragmatic incentive in the sense that we all know countries that are gender equal are more stable and more prosperous. Right now, we're seeing a backlash against women's rights and gender equality around the world. And I don't think it's a coincidence that at the same time we're seeing increased crisis, militarization, conflict, and so on. So from a very pragmatic standpoint, it's in favor of Canada's security itself. Our government has had to take Canadians out of countries around the world. That is a huge financial drain, but also a logistical dilemma. And, you know, our supply chains are affected. We are not our own economy. We're part of the rest of the world. Everything is affected by what happens in the rest of the world. And so it's really, you know, a good... Yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to please put another question. We don't have much time. That's very instructive what you've said. You proposed a tax of 15% on the surplus profits from companies that have made profits during the crisis, during COVID-19, and also during this current financial crisis. And we've seen that the government has promised that the big grocery stores that have made excessive profits need to reduce prices. Otherwise, they could have a tax of 15% imposed on them. You're suggesting there should be 50% tax on super profits. Do you think we need to go ahead with that, or should it be on a voluntary basis?
Yes, we should definitely go ahead with that. Again, we're hearing, the government is struggling to meet their responsibility of delivering public services, and yet we're seeing these corporations reaping in record profits. In budget 23, financial sector windfall tax was introduced. However, that's not enough. It really needs to cover all sectors that are profiting from crises that we're seeing, whether that's energy crisis, food crisis, housing crisis, and so on. So, yes, definitely a high priority.
Seconds.
Could we please have the mic? Well, it's quite staggering to hear that these banks could almost be considered as a sovereign country. But could you tell us a bit more about the climate change policies?
Oui, mais je serais heureuse d'en discuter.
Yes, I'd be happy to discuss this in more depth, but I think we could turn to the European Union example, which has really moved ahead with banking regulations so that they can pursue sustainable financing. I've got a report on that. I can talk about that later.
And now we're going to MP Blakey. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all our witnesses for appearing today. My first questions will be for Chief Bernard, and I'm wondering, in the last budget, there were more details about investment tax credits for a range of clean technologies and things of that nature. I'm wondering what you think the opportunities are for Indigenous communities to be able to make use of those ITCs, and in the development of those structures, what government and policymakers here in Ottawa could do to make sure that those result in meaningful equity stakes for Indigenous communities, as well as potential for community benefit agreements and other tools to ensure that this isn't just kind of multinationals coming in and taking things out, but that local people and Indigenous people with rights to the land and resources are also economic beneficiaries.
I'm going to hand it over to my colleague here, as I believe she was part of that submission last year. Thank you.
In response to the question of First Nations participating in those programs, as well as I think that we also need to address the fact that currently there's not enough funding for the First Nations to adequately be prepared to take advantage of those programs. And so that's a huge challenge for the First Nations. And in our budget submissions, identifying those programs and providing support to those First Nations in order to be prepared to take advantage of any programs that the federal government puts forward is very challenging. So I may not be able to adequately respond to you, but I think that the mechanism that we need to put into place is more important than actually addressing a specific program. The pre-budget submission process for the 634 First Nations that the AFN advocates on behalf of is not adequate for us to be able to provide the rationale for why we're asking for these priorities to be funded. And I think that it's not an investment and it's not a funding request. It is actually asking for Canada to uphold its fiduciary responsibility. And by doing that, our mechanisms that we propose would be a new relationship, a new fiscal relationship, whereby Canada negotiates and discusses collectively and collaboratively with the First Nations in order to have a different, distinct First Nation-led process for its budget request. I think, too, as well, that if, with your permission, since I thank you for having invited us to present here, if I can maybe yield some time to the National Chief to do her closing comments, maybe that would... Perfect, thank you.
Thank you. So I do want to remind you that Canada is delinquent in substantial and overdue debt and continues to incur court costs, lose court cases, and settle court challenges. So while these are long-term investments, they also represent an opportunity for Canada to repay its debts in good faith to First Nations. I ask for support of this committee in saying to Canada that it is in all our interests that you pay the debt. Economic reconciliation requires Canada to abandon its adversary legal approaches to fulfill its fiduciary duties or obligations to First Nations. Paying this debt will demonstrate Canada's commitment toward progress in our shared journey towards truth, healing, and reconciliation. So with appreciation for your attention, the AFN thanks, and I thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And Chief Bernard, with what time I have remaining, I noticed your pin, and I wonder if you could speak briefly to the importance of establishing a red dress alert system in Canada. New Democrats have been calling for it. Yeah, I noticed.
That's great.
New Democrats have been calling for it, and I think have had good leadership with my colleague from Winnipeg Centre, Leah Gazan, on this file. Just wonder if you could speak to the importance of getting that up and going quickly.
Oh, absolutely. It's something that it goes hand in hand with, the MMIWG is the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. It's very, very important, but I think we might have gone a little too fast in pushing to have the name MMIWG, because we are getting a lot of requests from the Assembly of First Nations across Canada in reference to boys and men. So I'm thinking, I'm trying to figure out a way and a solution here to not to have another set of MMIWG and have one but kind of figure out how we can do this and save funding if we could find the inclusive, all-inclusive, as well as the two SLBTQIA+ community and neglected Indigenous peoples. So it's something it's bigger than what it is now, and I'm hoping to get it to that point where everybody and everyone is all inclusive.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Blakey, members, witnesses, we're into our second round of questions. Timings are a little bit different in this round. We're starting with 5 minutes for MP Lawrence.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all the witnesses to be here, and everyone did a great job of presenting material, and I really do appreciate you being here. Unfortunately, these committees, we have to make such weird transitions from subjects to other subjects here. But I'm going to talk to you, Mr. Aslan, a little bit about productivity. It's something that you've talked about. It's something we've heard a lot from all sides of the table with respect to productivity. One of the comments from one of your writings in your article, the new Trudeau cabinet, same old spending. This hurts the middle class. You said, and I don't wish to get into a partisan discussion, I just want to talk meat and potatoes here about productivity. Redistributing of borrowed money may look virtuous, but in the end it'll make us all collectively poor. And then you go on to talk about the 23 cents on every dollar that goes to debt servicing. Couldn't you talk about that and actually the impact of the government spending money? Although it might have the best intent, it actually will hurt the most vulnerable in our society there, if you agree with that.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I think it's fair to say we do have a growth problem in this country, a business investment problem, which is obviously linked to productivity. And the way to do this, the way to remediate to this problem is to have pro-growth policies, pro-growth framework that allows us to grow our economy so that we can do all the good things I think that people around this table want to do for our economy, for Canadians. But in the absence of growth, in the absence of productivity enhancement in this country, unfortunately, what we'll do is just do deficit financing on every new measures. And that leads to more debt servicing, and it leads to governments at one point making hard decisions on program cuts or raising taxes. which would decrease business investments. So, you know, and the other thing I would say is we live in a very competitive world. The U.S. has moved aggressively on the IRA. It has led to huge business investments. In here, I would say we're still very tentative. All these tax credits that the government put forward for the green transition are yet to be implemented. I cannot stress enough how important it is that we compete with a level playing field that allows business investments to grow. And so we need more business investments to do all the good things we need to finance.
I think that's right, and I think in listening to some of Mr. Morneau's comments, I think he would echo a lot of those comments with respect to the lack of growth. Is it a bridge too far, Mr. Aslan, to say if this government continues to spend at a rate of ever growing in 2.5% or beyond, as they've continued to spend, that we're going to start to put at risk some of our social policies, some of our social benefits, some of the things that Canadians hold dearest if we don't get our spending under control?
I certainly don't like the trend we're on. And I would say, as I said in my remarks, the big game changer here is that interest rates are now higher than growth rates. And that will affect the primary deficit just to grow on itself, as I think Mr. Dodge explained to this group last week or previously. And so this is what happened in the 90s, is that we were not able to generate enough growth to reduce our deficit. So growth has to come first.
Thank you very much. And same topic of economic growth and innovation, but I'm going to switch to Mr. Francis. I'm going to ask you a flip question, but I think it's important to underscore the point because the government members haven't seemed to be able to comprehend or understand this. What year is it, and what season are we in?
Year is it? It's 2023, and it's looking like fall outside.
Okay, that's my understanding too. And what did the government say that they would have open banking legislation in front of us?
No later than the beginning of 2023.
Okay, and so we're well past the beginning of 2023. And are you aware of any legislation that has been passed or put in front of the House of Commons with respect to open banking?
No legislation has been put forth.
Okay, and the other, then just switching topics, but on the same vein, I don't think many Canadians understand, and perhaps you can help explain this to Canadians. They believe, I think most Canadians believe, that when they use their Interact card or their credit card, that it's in real time and instantaneous. It's actually not, is my understanding, and to use some colloquialisms, it's a little bit like a duct tape system just to make those payments go through. And not only is that system weak and potentially vulnerable, it is also holding us back with respect to developing as an economy. Is that true?
And I'd need a 15-second answer because we're out of time.
Though a lot of these payments feel like they're being made in real time, they are not, and the institutions making them are essentially fronting money to one another, creating credit risk in the system.
Thank you. 11 seconds. That was great. So now we're going out to MP Baker for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thanks to all the witnesses for being here today. What a wonderful panel, and I wish I had at least 5 minutes with each of you, and I, of course, don't. So please know that I apologize to those who I won't have a chance to ask questions of, but know that we value your presentations, and we're listening to your responses to the questions of others as well. And before I begin with the person I want to ask questions to, I will say that it's great to be here with a few folks that I know well. George Smitherman in particular, former Deputy Premier of Ontario, and actually, as I recall, someone who grew up in my riding of Etobicoke Centre, and he now lives in Simcoe North, which I try not to hold against him. It's still a sore spot for me, but good to see you here, George, and Chief. It's wonderful to see you here, and all the others as well. So thank you. I'm going to start with Mr. Asselin, if I may, and sometimes what happens when the Bank of Canada governor or anyone else speaks, sometimes there are certain MPs who have selective hearing. They hear the things that they want to hear and maybe don't hear the things that they don't want to hear. So when we've had the Bank of Canada governor come to this committee multiple times, and he's spoken here and publicly about what's caused inflation. And what he's talked about is the war in Ukraine, and the impact that's had on food and energy prices around the world. He's talked about supply chain bottlenecks post-COVID. He's talked about extreme weather events, which have caused droughts and floods and impacted our agriculture sector around the world. He and many others who've come to this committee, who are objective, nonpartisan experts on the economy, say that these are the major causes of inflation. Would you agree with that?
I would agree there were major components to inflation rising, and all the ones you mentioned, I think, are correct.
And you know, it's interesting because we actually had someone who was an expert in agriculture and the pricing of food come to speak with us. I believe it was the last meeting that we had here last week, and he said that the price that he echoed what we've just talked about, but he talked about how the cause of food inflation, at least that Canadians are feeling in particular, which is I think the area that I hear the most concerns about from my constituents in Etobicoke Centre, is primarily caused by these factors. So I think it's important to note that, right, that we now you had spoken about, you've talked a little bit today about the fact that you've talked about the fiscal future, that you'd like to see restraint. I mean, I think the challenge I have as a member of Parliament, both for my constituents, but also I think of the folks who are sitting here today, and you've got a sampling of, we hear from a lot of folks here, I hear from a lot of folks in my community who say, we need you investing more here. You know, we've heard from the chief, we've heard from the Cannabis Council, we've heard from others, from Oxfam. And so there are a lot of demands for government to increase spending in certain areas. There are existing programs that people depend on. So what are the things that you would have recommended that we not spend money on, or that we should not spend money on going forward, that we are spending money on, to get to the fiscal position that you're suggesting? Like, what should we cut, I guess is what I'm asking.
So this is for the government to decide, what's the elected government to decide where it wants to put its focus on in terms of spending priorities. What I'm saying is, going forward, the fiscal framework that has a structural deficit in the context of high interest rates and rising going forward will put these very important priorities, and I agree with you, they are all important, in jeopardy. So this is what I'm trying to say we want to preserve. We want to preserve healthcare. We want to preserve post-secondary education. We want to preserve international aid. And by spending more, unfortunately, you will put these things in jeopardy, in my opinion. So I'm not here to say to the government, here's where you need to cut. What I'm saying is the trajectory of spending right now is not sustainable.
Right, but the corollary to that is, therefore, if we followed your advice, is we'd have to find something to cut, right? Like, you're presenting a problem, but I guess what I'm asking you is, what is the solution?
Well, the first solution is to grow the economy higher than what we have right now, which is, stagnation, because the inflation was high. Of course, the Bank of Canada had to do a lot of work here. But going forward, a growth rate of real GDP of 1% or below 2% will make it very difficult for the government to finance the thing it wants to. And again, I'd love to have all these great social programs sustainable, protected, but without growth, in a high interest rates environment, we will struggle to keep them in place, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's my time.
MP Baker, yes, that is
sure,
the
Chair?
time. Yeah,
I was just getting started.
I am sure. So we are going to MP Samari, please, for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and welcome to all of my colleagues and witnesses. Thank you for being here, and sorry that I arrived so abruptly. And Yvonne, sorry that we've got such a strict chair with the MPs, and I think he's also strict with the witnesses in terms of timing. And Ms. Zaroti, I believe that you started to talk about your recommendations about decarbonisation, or looking at the carbon footprint of the Canadian banking sector and their portfolio there. Could you continue with that, please? Could you continue with your explanations? Or perhaps Ms. Pelletier, Marcotte, I hadn't seen you there. Yes, Oxfam Quebec last fall published a report on the carbon footprint of banks and the main deposit institutions in Canada, and we realised that if they were considered a sovereign country, they would be the fifth largest emitter of greenhouse gases because of what they actually finance, not just because of their daily banking activities or their sources of energy or their suppliers, but because of the financed emissions. They just come behind the US, China, India, and Russia in fifth place as largest emitter. So what we're asking for is to take the step to be ambitious in Canada when we regulate the banking sector, because the banking sector is not moving ahead itself. So we're asking to give them a nudge in the right direction with legislative and regulatory measures that would force these financial institutions to be more ambitious and to unveil the full carbon impact of their portfolio, including their investment portfolios, and also develop a green tax system which would be clear when we're defining sustainable investment and so-called green investments. And this needs to be transparent for consumers and also for those who are saving across Canada. So it's a group of experts that looked at this in 2019 that came up with several recommendations. These have not been fully adopted. We would ask for these to be comprehensively recommended. There's also a bill before the Senate which is moving ahead slowly, but it was a good starting point. S243, it's not perfect, but it is moving, and we also want that there should be recognition that polluting investments and polluting industries represent a significant financial risk for the economic vitality of Canada and our investments. So we want the risk of these investments to actually be recognized. Thank you very much.
And over to MP Blakey.
Merci beaucoup. À ce même sujet, est-ce que vous pensez...
Thank you. On the same subject, do you think the decision that Madame Freeland has to make about the acquisition of HSBC by RBC would actually be important? Is it symbolically or strategically important when it comes to the future of the financial sector in Canada and its actual capacity to be an investor in a greener economy? Thank you very much for that question as well. I cannot specifically comment on this. I'm not an economist, nor am I a specialist in competition law or the banking sector. But I think we should also be concerned about the reduction of competition in any sector, including the banking sector. And in our report, we're not necessarily blaming certain specific banking institutions, but I think it's no secret that RBC has an investment portfolio that's quite problematic. And with the HSBC, we have to kind of look at that.
The financial industry and this problem that you've highlighted of, you know, a kind of an oligopoly that tends not to have a sufficient amount of competition. Are you concerned that an approval of the RBC-HSBC merger will tend to perpetuate the current less competitive culture in Canada's financial sector? And do you think that that could have negative consequences for Canadian consumers of financial products?
So though the association is not close enough to the particulars of the deal to have an informed opinion about whether the acquisition should be approved or disapproved, we don't think the decision should be taken lightly. Big five banks in this country control 90% of the banking assets. They also control a lot of financial infrastructure. They gatekeep in that financial infrastructure. And any decision that does significantly lessen rivalry between our banks will just put upward pressure on banking fees, customer service, cost of capital, all the things we need to grow the economy.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Now to MP Helen for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here. Mr. Aslan, my questions will be to you. Thanks for being here. In a recent letter, Goldie Hyder, that he wrote a letter to Chrystia Freeland, he said in there he wanted her to avoid spending in the fall economic update and to, quote, set a clear fiscal anchor focused on managing the growing cost of servicing debt, unquote. Numerous people, whether it's the former Governor of the Bank of Canada, David Dodge, even current Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland, and current Governor of the Bank of Canada, Tiff Macklem, have all said that deficits fuel inflation. And what we see is, because of that, in the last 19 months, there's been 10 interest rate hikes, putting Canada most at risk in the G7 for mortgage default crisis now. All that spending led to inflation, led to these interest rate hikes. And now Canada's in this really risky position. Goldie mentioned in that letter, quote, with long-term interest rates at the highest they've been in years, it is irresponsible to suggest that economic growth will be higher than interest rates for years to come. And as you said, governments can no longer run permanent large deficits without fear. Can you reiterate if one of those fears is this mortgage default crisis, and what other fears are you talking about when you say fear?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I think for me, the faster we go back to price stability, which is 2%, the better it will be for the economy, the better it will be for Canadians, the better it will be for the government to get back in a position, to your point, where we can reinvest, we can grow the economy, and we're not worried about putting too much debt into future generation. So the more time it takes to get back to 2%, the more painful the crisis of affordability will be. Higher the prices remain, the less good it is for all Canadians. This is why fiscal policy right now, at this moment, needs to be very disciplined. We need to be very disciplined. This is not a political statement for me. It's just a policy stance.
Is it disciplined right now?
I would say that, I think Governor Macklem was correct yesterday when he said that over 2% growth in spending for governments doesn't help him to bring back inflation to 2%. That's just a factual thing. And without making, I don't want to go into the politics of it, it's just math. We need to go back to 2%. I think the governor is keen to go back to 2%. He understands the importance of it. We as a country have decided that 2% was important for inflation, for price stability. And the more time it takes, the more painful it will be for Canadians, unfortunately.
In that vein, as we were discussing pre-budget consultations, I believe it's really important that we include the context of where Canada is in terms of the battle of fiscal and monetary policy and its effect on inflation. Yesterday, the Governor of the Bank of Canada, Tiff Macklem, at his monetary policy report press conference, reiterated his concerns around government spending adding more to demand than what supply can keep up with. In other words, when you have too many dollars chasing too few goods, you get inflation. The Liberals have had inflationary deficit after inflationary deficit, adding more to the national debt than every government before them combined. That flooded the economy with money driving up demand, while historic low productivity meant supply could not keep up. As a result, we have 40-year highs in inflation, followed by the fastest interest rate hikes in Canadian histories, and now mortgages, household debt, and even government debt are all more expensive. As we discuss with Canadians, what Canadians need to see in the next budget, I think it's important that we include the context given yesterday by Governor Macklem. That is why I wish to move the following motion: that the committee concur in and report to the House of Commons the comments made by the Governor of Bank of Canada on October 25th, 2023, when he said, quote, "We expect government spending to grow at 2.5%. What that means is if all those spending plans are realized, government spending will be adding to demand more than to the supply is growing, and in an environment where we are trying to moderate spending and get inflation down. That's not helpful." So I'd like to move that motion and continue on.
Okay, so the motion has been moved by MP Helen. Yeah, MP Blakey.
Notice had already been given
Had notice been given?
of that motion, or is he giving notice today and then moving it another day?
Right now at this moment?
And he's moving and noticing.
That's committee business.
Sorry, point of order there. So I believe that this is permitted because we are on the same topic of the day, right? So,
It does
so notice is not required.
Yeah, it does pertain to the PBC. Yeah.
I'm sorry, it's not obvious to me that a motion to agree with a statement that was made outside the context of this room is germane to pre-budget consultation. So if it was a motion that had something to do with how we were going to conduct ourselves in pre-budget consultation, that would be one thing. If it was something arising out of testimony, it would be another thing. This is a completely other thing, and it's fair game for Mr. Halland to give notice of a motion like that today. But I don't see that it's relevant to our pre-budget consultation study, except insofar as Conservative members have talked about what the Governor of the Bank of Canada has said. But I think that's pretty slim grounds procedurally to be able to move a motion like this without notice.
Thank you, MP Blakey. We're just going to suspend. I'll confer with the clerk. After conferring with the clerk and the analysts, in my opinion, it does not pertain to the PBC. So we will continue with our meeting.
Mr. Chair, just a point of order, and this has happened a couple times, and that's why I raised this. So we've had discussions debates, discussions with respect to the administration of this committee, and Conservatives have raised an issue. We've heard the other side, but we don't often get a chance on a rebuttal, which I don't think is I think that actually violates the principles of natural justice.
It's not a point of order. I've made my decision. I've made my decision.
Mr. Chair,
so you could challenge my decision, MP Lawrence, but I've made my decision.
Yeah. Mr. Chair, that was a point of order. It was pertaining to the future operation, which is what a point of order is. It's about the rules of the committee, and I was making a valid point of order with respect to the operation of the. So it was a valid point of order, and I just put it in your ear for going forward. It was meant to be instructive going forward, not with respect to this decision, and I am aware that I can challenge your decision as I have done before.
So, MP Allen?
I'd like to make a point of order.
Point of order. MP Baker?
I think it's really also important in terms of, on that very topic of how we work going forward, is that we respect the witnesses there before us who are here to present. Many of them have traveled here to speak about pre-budget consultations, and so I would suggest as we move forward as a committee that we refrain from political grandstanding and debates before the witnesses, and that we set aside time for that if that's where the committee wants to spend its time.
Thank you, MP Baker, for that. Yeah, I do. We do have a great group of witnesses here. We would like to respect the witnesses. We would like to get back to the questions and answers, but if MP Hallen?
Yes. Yeah, and we would like to respectfully challenge the chair, and this is why we believe that the motion directly talks about spending. Or pre-budget consultations is primarily about how the government's spending the resources. So we believe we're solidly within the topics raised today, and in fact, that testimony was not only raised once but multiple times at this committee prior to bringing the motion, and one of the things that, of course, Conservatives are keen on, and in fact, we've heard from Mr. Aslan as well as numerous other witnesses, that spending should be brought under control and that monetary and fiscal policy should be brought together as opposed to operating separately. As John Manley said, this government continues to hit the inflationary gas pedal, and we need that to stop so that Canadians can keep a roof over their heads.
Okay, thank you, MP Lawrence. Clerk, if you could just poll the members.
Should the decision of the chair be sustained? MP Baker?
Sustain.
MP Bendayan?
Oui.
Yes.
MP Zerowitz?
Sustain. Sustain.
MP Weiler?
Sustain.
MP Chambers?
No.
MP Halan?
No.
MP Lawrence?
No.
MP Morans?
No.
Monsieur Saint-Marie?
Oui.
Mr. Blakey?
Okay.
Non, il avait dit MP Thompson?
Sustain.
That's 7 yeas, 4 nays.
Okay, the decision sustained, and so we'll get back to our questions and answers. MP Allen, you have a minute, please.
Mr. Aslan, Philip Cross appeared before our committee recently and reiterated his concerns about Canada's productivity. He noted productivity as low as it was in the 1930s, the Great Depression, literally. Professor Ian Lee and former Governor of the Bank of Canada, David Dodge, also warned about Canada's declining productivity. How concerned are you guys about the impact of these high interest rates and low productivity and the lack of investment coming into Canada? Is there a link between those two?
Mr. Chair, absolutely. And structurally, these things cannot continue. Otherwise, our living standards will decline, unfortunately, as a country. I'm happy to see the wage increases for workers right now, but they're not sustainable if we don't have the productivity that comes with it. Unfortunately, at one point, we're going to have to become more innovative, more productive to sustain these wage increases. Otherwise, they will be inflationary, and it will just make the Bank of Canada job more difficult, unfortunately.
Thank you, MP Allen. And now we're going to MP Weiler, please.
Thank you, Chair, and appreciate getting back to the testimony from our esteemed witnesses, and appreciate what they've already provided to our committee today. I would like to turn to questions to Mr. Smitherman and the Cannabis Council of Canada. It's really incredible to think that an economic sector was created out of nothing in just 3 years that invested $45 billion to the Canadian economy and 150,000 broadly distributed jobs across Canada by legalization of cannabis. But given the cumulative taxes reached the level you mentioned, it's not surprising that so few companies are at profitability today. And I understand that the structure and formula of the excise tax has greatly contributed to the relative tax that's paid by producers, and that this formula may have been based on an assumption that no longer holds true. And so I was hoping you could explain this to the committee.
Thanks. Thank you so much for the question, for your interest in our sector. At the heart of it, when cannabis was first proposed for adult use recreational legalization, the premise that finance advanced was a $10 gram would have a $1 tax. We have the $1 tax. It never changes, but the gram is $3.50. So the ratio of the tax is enormous, and actually, as our producers have reduced prices, anti-inflationary, over the last number of years, the implication has been that the ratio of the tax has even grown. When you look at, say, a 1 ounce bag, which is a pretty common purchase, 28 grams, you've got, varies by province because we have a lot of different models out there, but upwards of 50 or frequently 60 cents on the dollar is going to government in one form or another. It's just not leaving enough for the regulated sector on either side. That's the retailers or the producers that I represent who've been involved in that $45 billion investment in those first 3 years, which produced, by the way, out of that $45 billion alone, $15 billion in taxes for governments in all forms.
And what impact would returning the tax structure to the original intent of 10% have on the profitability of the sector?
I think that the impact also would be that we'd be doing a better job of fulfilling the obligations of legalization, which included getting as many cannabis-consuming Canadians to consume safer and tested products. The impact on profitability would be very, very positive, and the impact of that would be that cannabis companies would be able to pay taxes across the range of taxes rather than just seeking to pay their excise. 17% of companies after 5 years being profitable is a significant canary in the coal mine for those many, many, many companies that are invested, that are operating in communities, many of them small and rural, relatively remote communities. They're operating in very, very challenging, constrained times, as there is no additional capital available for the sector.
Further to that, you also mentioned in your opening that the sector is facing challenges accessing basic financial services or facing usurious rates if they do. I'm just hoping you could please explain to the committee why that is and what that looks like.
It's like a situation where the big banks don't have any interest in participating in providing services to small companies. I run an industry association that does not touch cannabis. TD Bank, which is my historic banker, doesn't want to touch our association. We're forced to go and get our services from Alterna Savings and Loan, which charges our association, which doesn't touch cannabis, an extra $4,000 a year and $100 a month just for the privilege of having operating accounts. So those independent retailers that many of you will have in your ridings, depending on the province that you're from, understand that those retailers are burdened with a lack of access to financial services and are frequently forced to pay outrageous amounts just to get basic banking services. And I think just one other point, it was mentioned that by Alex, because I don't want to mispronounce his last name, that they are sometimes proprietary. Let's say the big banks around the use of the Interact system. One of the ironies is that our legitimate, legalized, regulated sector does not have access to financial services, but the same banks and their Interact system operate and provide lots of services to online illicit market. Same as Canada Post delivers those illicit products. So there's a real stinging irony to that circumstance for many in the legalized cannabis sector.
Thank you. And thank you, MP Weiler. I'm just looking at the time. I want to get through another round. This will be our third round. But I will have to be pretty strict on the time, and I'll say accept that MP Saint-Marie for that. So we're going to start with MP Chambers for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Smitherman. Welcome. It's always nice to see a neighbor here at a committee. Just want to stay with you for a minute. Excise tax, and I understand the principal basis for which we might request the government review their position. If they're not inclined to do so, there's also an issue with, or an opportunity with labeling, is there not, to reduce the costs associated or placed on producers that could save them significant amounts of money?
The operation of the excise tax, which includes this stamp, which is quite an onerous application on the wide variety of products that we have, as well as the means of remitting excise in its own right, are two operational matters which could be addressed and significantly assist with bottom line costs for cannabis operators. I could say also that there's a regulatory fee which we pay, which is a priority that we have advanced to the government that they might get at to offer more urgent relief.
Right. And my understanding is the overburdened requirements for physical labeling create a lot of costs for producers. And so if you moved to or accepting like a digital label, a scanned QR code, you wouldn't even have to touch the excise tax. You could strip out a lot of costs for industry, correct?
Yeah, it's true that this is in a certain sense what we might call a non-cost item for government. It's governments, because obviously the provinces and territories are partners in this matter, but that would be an opportunity to significantly abate operating costs. anyone that's purchased a cannabis product, and if you haven't, go try one out. We have a range of products, including, we can't bring samples. Sadly, that's not legal. But I was anticipating the question. I think that anybody that's witnessed, we have a stamp model where for every province and territory, a producer must apply that province or territory stamp. They're real tricky. It's pretty much a manual process, which makes it very expensive. And worst is a circumstance where if you shipped your product, say, to Saskatchewan and it wasn't moving, and you wanted to bring it back and reapply it into Manitoba, the stamps have to be removed by hand. They have to be stuck to a piece of paper. They have to be resubmitted to CRA. And for anyone that you lose, you have a $30 fine and 6 months to wait to get paid back, et cetera. So this is an area of significant opportunity for operational cost reduction without losing anything, if you will, from the revenue side for governments.
How many times is a producer audited per year by CRA?
The producer is audited by CRA, I think, at least quarterly. The thing is that actually audits that were in place before COVID fell off during COVID and has created quite a conundrum for a lot of companies who've gotten kind of out of sorts with CRA, which is causing for some very, very aggressive collections work at the moment. There's a lot of duplicative auditing also, where we have a regulatory system called CTLS that Health Canada runs, and very frequently the audits that we're involved in with CRA are a duplication of the same information that's already been shared in those systems.
Thank you. That's very helpful. If they move to the excise sticker to a digital one, makes no difference, can save a lot of money, and we can move on. Mr. Aslan, the government's had a varying number of fiscal anchors over 8 years. A tweet from the Minister of Finance yesterday seems to indicate the new fiscal anchor is we have the lowest debt in the G7, and we all have the lowest debt to GDP in the G7. In your mind, does that count as a fiscal anchor? And if not, I think you recommended one, and maybe explain why. We've got 30 seconds, and I'll stay on time for the chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I think the debt anchor that the government has right now is not one that's going to be able to meet, frankly. Debt to GDP ratio is going to go up this year and probably next year, which unfortunately for the government doesn't look like the fiscal anchor will be respected. We think that the debt, 10% of debt servicing costs to 10% of revenues is reasonable, and we think that it will prevent all the bad things that I explained earlier.
Thank you. And thank you, MP Chambers. And now to MP Zarowitz for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you so much. Hello. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. And thanks to all the witnesses. I really have like 10 minutes for each one of you, but I don't have all the time I would like to have. Mr. Smithman, thank you for being here. You have a long history in politics. You've done an enormous service to Ontario, to our country. So thank you so much. Thanks for taking on this enormous role. You've been very clear in terms of your recommendations around the adjustment excise tax, elimination of the health tax fee, and the regulated format for things like edibles, et cetera. So thank you for being clear. Bienvenido to your board director. It's nice to have him here as well. So I don't have any more questions for you, but I just want to say that your recommendations were clear. Mr. Aslan, you are not a stranger to this committee. You have been here fairly frequently, and we're always pleased to have you. Your messages have also been very clear on keeping spending to 2%, a comprehensive program review, a new fiscal anchor, the IAA clarity, certainty, predictability. And so the thing that I'm slightly disappointed on, and I'm going to sort of shift over to Mr. Vrances, but I'm hoping to come back to you if I have time, is I would love to have heard more suggestions from you on growing the economy. As you know, I have spoken many times to Mr. Hyder about interprovincial trade barriers. This is a huge thing. And if you think it's a huge thing, then you're never going to be able to tackle it. But there are ways to break it down, and there are things that we can do. And having suggestions that are productive from the Business Canadian Council would actually be helpful to us. The productivity levels in business investment, this is not a new thing. It didn't just happen overnight. It didn't happen over the last 4 years. Productivity has been something we've been dealing with for 30 years. We have issues around Competition Act. We know this. We know we have productivity issues. We know we have business investment issues. We know our businesses are not investing in machinery. They're not investing in training. It is a problem. Where it would be really helpful is if you could actually come to us and say, here is how you can get businesses on track. Here is how you can provide some incentives to actually get more businesses to provide those types of investments. That would be helpful to us. If we don't have time today, I'd be grateful if you could actually make that submission to our
member.
Yeah.
I think I've written at least 4 or 5 papers on industrial policy, innovation, productivity.
No, that's great.
And so
then
we have a lot of solutions for these problems.
So that's great, Ms. Lass, but it would be great if you mentioned that today.
Right.
Here's where you need to do in terms of, restraining your growth, but here's where you need to focus on. If I had to give you 1 or 2 or 3 recommendations for federal budget 2024, this is where we'd like to
But I did
go.
mention permitting. And I did mention implementing tax credits that the government announced last budget.
Yes, and actually that's the other thing I want to mention. We did put in our clean energy federal toolkit, and so we've put in quite a bit of money. Would love to hear feedback from you in terms of, great on these levels, here's the things you need to be adjusting. So if you can provide that, and I say this with all genuineness, we want to get it right. It is fundamental that we get that right. So if you could do that, that would be great. Then I'm going to go to Mr. Vronson. I'm hoping to come back to you, Mr. Esselin. Look, I'm a big supporter of open banking. I have been a big supporter and on record for that. There was testimony that Mr. Sabia, the former deputy minister, made at Senate committee in May 2023, earlier this year, and he indicated very clearly that the federal government's actually seized with this. We are trying to make sure that we're moving as fast as possible. What he said right now is there's a complexity around how is it that we can provide the stability that the system needs while moving and shifting into open banking in a world right now that is highly unpredictable, okay? So I just want to let the record show that that is something that we have indicated that is a priority for our government, and it is imminent that we hope to be able to put that forward. So my question in my remaining minute to you is, I know that fintechs have membership. There's a number of different ways to pay, like ForPay and PaySend and Stripe and Square. How do the fintechs membership help build credit for financially underserved in Canada, and what role do you see your membership playing in the future? If you could respond to that, please.
Yeah, so one of the best examples I can think of that's gotten plenty of attention anywhere it's been talked about is Borwell's Rent Advantage program. They have a product that allows Canadians who might not have lengthy credit history, or are new Canadians who don't have a credit history that's recognized by financial institutions, use rent payments to build their credit score. My understanding is that they were the first company in Canada to do that. That kind of product is built on the back of what open banking would enable. Unfortunately now, the problem is that the only way banks give Canadians to share their financial information is unreliable and risky. Connections are often coming down, resulting in disruptions to the service. It gets in the way of Canadians trying to meet their financial objectives. I also agree that anytime you try to change financial sector policy, there are going to be complexities and risks that need to be managed. But the status quo is also fraught with risks, and those risks need to be managed. And my understanding is that the department and our open banking lead are ready to go. They have been ready to go for months. They haven't consulted on this for a long time, and they've been consulting on this for over 5 years. What we need now is attention from the Minister of Finance to actually make a decision and give Canadians a way to access a wider range of financial services without compromising their financial security and their privacy.
Thank you, MP Zerowitz. And now to MP Samari, please, for 2.5 minutes.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président. Donc,
thank you very much, Chair. I have a question for Oxfam Quebec. Of course, we're very much concerned about these increasing wealth gaps. We have to fight against the use of tax havens, but what else can we do as a complement to have a more equitable fiscal system?
As I mentioned in my comments, a wealth tax is definitely one fiscal level that the government can use. It's very clear to everyone these days the just exorbitant level of inequality in wealth. People on the streets talk about it now because it's so extreme. And in polling that was recently conducted, 89% of Canadians were in favor of a wealth tax. So a wealth tax of 2% over 5 million, 3% over 50 million, and 5% over $1 billion of wealth could raise $30 billion in the first year in revenues. So this is one of the measures that, again, could help in making sure there are no services cut in terms of the inflation and debt issue.
Je vous remercie beaucoup. Monsieur le Président, je vous remercie.
And thank you very much, Chair.
Sainte-Marie, and
Merci, Monsieur Sainte-Marie.
I certainly appreciate the extra time. Professor Purdon, I wanted to ask, we obviously the carbon tax continues to go up. So do oil and gas company profits. And I know earlier you were able to kind of translate what increases in the carbon tax meant at the pump for Canadians. Have you yourself or anyone that you're aware of done work to try and translate the increase in profits for oil and gas companies into a cost at the pump for Canadians? And how would that compare to the carbon price increase?
That's an interesting question. I haven't looked at that, and I don't know anyone who has, but I think it could be done. So maybe it's something we could look at. I know I work regularly with economists at UQAM and others across Canada. I'm not an economist by training, but I try and speak the language. But that could be something that could be increasing. I don't want to speculate here, but I think as colleagues at Oxfam were also mentioning, there are substantial subsidies to the oil and gas sector still that make it so there's not really a level playing field. We could probably get there's probably pretty clear numbers on that in Canada. That could be, although that's sort of reducing the cost is going in another direction for consumers and producers, but definitely a worthwhile issue to consider.
It seems to me that the increase in profit that oil and gas companies have experienced far exceeds what revenue is being generated by the carbon tax, and I think it would be interesting to do that comparison as an apples to apples exercise. Because I think if you're a Canadian and you're looking at your household budget and trying to figure out how to put food on the table, doesn't really matter whether the increase comes in the form of a tax or whether it's an increase in order to pay higher dividends to oil and gas shareholders. At the end of the day, that puts the same amount of pressure on your budget, and it certainly seems like oil and gas companies have been getting a pretty good ride through the pandemic period. I think even from 2019 to 2021, there are some examples of profit increases of up to 1,000%, which sounds far more dramatic to me than the increase in the carbon tax. So I thank you for that, and certainly if you do find some of those numbers, if you could forward them on to the committee here, we'd be very appreciative of that information. Thank you.
Thank you, MP Blakey, and now MP Morantz for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Aslan, after 8 long years of this Liberal government, despite historically high deficits, this Liberal government has left Canada with the lowest GDP per capita since the Great Depression. Ms. Zurwitz says she's disappointed and asked for you to explain all of the things you've written about over the years. Her government should have done
Let the record show, Mr. Chair, point of order. I did not say that.
So
I did not say that. Point of order, Mr. Morantz, I did not say that.
You said
I did not say that, Mr. Morantz. Mr. Chair,
it is a point of order. The members just being clear as to what was said on the record. MP Morantz.
Okay, I appreciate that.
Order.
Do I have my time back on that point of order, Mr. Chair?
MP Morantz, time is yours.
I know you're always fair with time. So, Mr. Aslan, here's your chance. Explain to Ms. Zurwitz all the things you've written about over the years that would have helped her government make sure we had high growth instead of anemic growth over all these years.
something that's very close to my heart, which is innovation. I think every country that does industrial policy seriously has innovative capabilities. And what we don't have in this country, we have high-performing universities that do world-class research, and we have great companies. What we haven't done is connect the two together in the way that Americans, Germans, South Koreans have done with institutional capabilities, such as in the U.S., DARPA, NASA, Fraunhofer in Germany. And so all this intellectual capital that we're producing in Canada does not translate into the economy because we have not created the incentive for it to transfer into our private companies. As long as we don't address this fundamental problem in our kind of science, technology, architecture, I believe we're going to have a weak performance and productivity. And so I've written many papers on this. If members are interested, they can go on the Business Council website to get more on it.
Thank you very much. I have a question for you, Ms. Bernard, and Ms. Pellerin. It has to do with C-69. What we affectionately call the No More Pipelines bill. I just wonder if your organization has a position on this. We know that the Supreme Court recently opined that several sections of this bill are unconstitutional, and the government announced it's going to have to retool it. My understanding is this legislation makes no mention of UNDRIP, doesn't really address the idea of economic reconciliation, which is one of the points you raised in your opening statement. I'm wondering if you agree that this legislation is seriously flawed and needs to be reworked.
I apologize. I thought the question was referring to Mark, but
No,
when I'm hearing you as you were explaining it, it makes no. You're saying the submission makes no reference to UNDRA. I apologize.
Bill C-69. What we call the No More Pipelines bill, creates administrative roadblocks to not only oil and gas, but things like mines, critical minerals, those types of things. The Supreme Court of Canada just ruled that many of its sections are unconstitutional. I was just wondering if your organization has any opinion on that piece of legislation, which does not mention UNDRIP.
Okay, I believe that was just recently that the court decision that was. Is that the one that you're talking about, the Bill C-69? Maybe you could refer to it because it's new.
Okay. In regards to AFN's position is that we don't really have a position. We support and advocate for the First Nations. And the issue of pipelines is one that each individual First Nation will be addressing. However, when it comes to reference to UNDRIP and to the UNDA, we will be we are looking at all of the legislations that is put forward by Canada, and so if in Canada's enactment of the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Peoples Act and its subsequent National Action Plan, the AFN will be ensuring that all the legislation in Canada, and Canada should also be doing this as their commitment to reflect their commitment to those documents, the UNDRIP, UNDA, and the National Action Plan. So I know that doesn't necessarily specifically answer your question, because it's not in my sector, so I'm not as able to elaborate on it as much. But we can actually perhaps follow up and provide some information.
Yeah.
But
that would be great if you have information on it. Sure. Okay.
Thank you. And if you could submit that to the committee, we'd appreciate it. And thank you, MP Moranza. Actually, MP Thompson, you're going to be our last questioner for today. So of these fine witnesses, so the 5 minutes to you, please.
Thank you. And again, I'm sorry that there isn't more time. Mr. Asselin, if I could ask you some questions. We've just come through the worst summer in history for forest fires in Canada, and clearly, across all sectors, there's been an impact, but companies are saying that they're feeling the impact of climate change. And a KPMG study from last week said or stated that nearly 6 out of 10 Canadian small businesses have been affected by some type of extreme weather event this year, and more than 50% of businesses surveyed have experienced a significant rise in their overall costs, 44% saying that it has directly hit their revenues. Can you speak to climate impacts on businesses over the last year?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the question is very relevant. Every company's big, small, we represent larger firms, obviously, but is dealing with this thing. It's not going to go away. It's just going to accelerate. The Business Council has been supportive of carbon pricing for the last 20 years. So this is something we've been supportive of. And so I think for the government, it's a question of being proactive on climate policy, but also on climate adaptation. And I think this summer has shown that the adaptation part maybe was underlooked maybe by policymakers, given the size of what's happening in the world on the climate change. I think it's fair to realize it's clear we are realizing that the adaptation side will need to take a more important kind of focus for policymakers.
I want to just zero in on that for a moment. Do you believe that carbon pricing is an effective way to, there's many things we have to do, but that it is effective in helping to address climate crisis?
Yes. In general, carbon pricing, I think, is something we've been supportive of. What I think is worrisome when I look at government intention, for example, on oil and gas cap production, that I think would be an overkill in actually would deconstruct the carbon pricing mechanism that is agnostic of sectors. So I would warn the government to really be careful about this measure.
Thank you. How much time do I have?
2 and a bit minutes.
Oh, good. Okay. And I'll stay with you, actually, and one more question for Mr. Perdon. It's not just small business, as you referenced, that are being impacted by climate crisis. It's obviously larger businesses as well. And they're saying that climate crisis will negatively impact the organization's prosperity over the next 3 years. Has your organization surveyed members, collected data on this? And if so, are you able to share that with this committee?
We have not. What we've done is produce policy documents, Innovate, Compete, and Win, recently that addressed, I think, the climate challenge from an economic perspective, a competitiveness standpoint, and I encourage all members to read it.
Thank you. And if I could switch to Professor Purdon, just for a quick question. Do you feel Canada is on track to achieve its climate targets in 2030?
That's a big question. I think the ambition is there, but and I'm not sure if this is there's not a consensus of this amongst academics working on these issues in Canada. But my feeling is that as the costs of carbon pricing go up, there's going to be something increasing political resentment to those costs. $170 per ton is double what we're at about right now. For Quebec to meet its emission reduction target, some of the economic modeling I've seen has said that price needs to go up to $300 a ton to meet its, which is a bit more ambitious than Canada's target. So it seems that it could become politically salient. And I'm just going to come back, and I'm happy to talk more about the Quebec-California carbon market, but carbon pricing isn't really politically salient in Quebec. We have agreement on both parties, the CAQ and the Liberals and the others. I mean, it's not, there's debates on other issues of climate policy, but, and that's maybe because the carbon price has been lower than in Canada, the rest of Canada. But that's one issue that, in the back of my mind, I think the international emissions trading could be explored as sort of a backstop on the backstop, if I can say that, in terms of carbon pricing, and also as a way of fostering international cooperation and allowing for other parts of the world where it's cheaper to reduce emissions to accelerate their decarbonization efforts there.
Thank you, and thank you, MP Thompson. That is the time. We want to thank our excellent, diverse group of witnesses that we have with us here today. You've done a tremendous job and in informing us in this study of the pre-budget consultation for the upcoming, in advance of Budget 2024. So we thank you on behalf of all the members, the clerks, the analysts, the interpreters that have done a fine job, and everybody in this room. Thank you very much, and we appreciate you coming before us. Thank you. We are adjourned, members.